Welcome to another Howling with the Wolfe session. There's no off season quite yet for Dolphins fans. We have a week or two, hopefully only a week or two, maybe longer, who knows, of a coaching search coming on. Adam Gase is out. You guys have probably heard the news by now. Fired after 3 years as Dolphins coach. And now the Dolphins are headed what looks like towards a rebuild era. Although they haven't used the word yet, they talked about young players. They talked about not putting band-aid fixes together, and they talked about finding the patience to have sustained winning. This is what owner Stephen Ross and Chris Greer talked about. Front office changes. Mike Tannenbaum's out. Chris Greer is the big man in charge. He's the king of the North out here, king of the South, I guess. There's a lot to talk about as far as the new era Dolphins. We'll talk a little bit about the playoffs, but mostly this will be a post season review as well as looking forward towards the Dolphins season and what to expect going forward. So, as always, thanks for joining. I'm Cameron Wolfe, the Wolf. If you guys are first time joining in here, you can fire away on that chat over on the side. That's where the questions you guys ask questions on, and I'll get to those as we go on the chat. I'll go ahead and monologue and just talk about whatever the topics are, and then you guys chime in, and we can just have a back and forth on this thing. I think that, if you guys haven't seen, the Dolphins have 6 candidates for the job, all with, varying levels of experience and qualities, and we can dig into those. I'm writing a story on ESPN.com that's going to come out tomorrow on these coaching staffs, of an in-depth look of what these guys bring, pros and cons, and what you should know as a fan. So look out for that in the morning. But otherwise, I'm here to give you guys some exclusive content on what you guys want to know. Info about the firing, info about what's going on as far as players and the locker room and the mindset, as well as candidates and what happens next. Quarterback's a big question mark. What happens with Ryan Tannehill, and going forward from there. So there are definitely quite a bit of topics to talk about. I think first I want to go ahead and jump into the Adam Gase situation as a whole, because we haven't talked since Adam Gase got fired. I think it was about 50-50 last week. And, obviously he's out. And I know he's interviewing for other coaches, other coaching opportunities this week. And, I wouldn't be surprised if he gets one. I've always said that I think that Adam Gase is a very smart coach. And I think that eventually he's going to be a really good coach in this league. So he's going to have to deal with, just learn, grow up as far as how he handles certain things and different personalities. But I think that he's going to eventually be a really good head coach. We forget that coaches fail sometimes and need a second chance. Bill Belichick failed in Cleveland before he got to New England. So I don't know if Adam Gase is the next Bill Belichick, but I wouldn't say that what happened in New England, in Miami, will be his tenure overall. So that's my thoughts on Adam Gase. Jared Hillbrand, I'm the Raven 842 from Twitter. Yes, I have a question about Darren Rizzi from you. I'm going to answer in a couple minutes. Thanks for joining us. Luis Velasquez, any truth to the rumor that you are the jinx for head coaches you cover? Maybe. I was actually talking with my wife about this. I have covered now. This will be my 6th head coach that I've covered, and I just finished my 4th full season as NFL reporter. So it's incredible. When I was in Denver, Gary Kubiak was there. I covered him for 2 seasons, and then he retired, and Vance Joseph took over, and then I moved to Tennessee for the ESPN job, and I covered Mike Mularkey, and he got fired, and then I covered Mike Vrabel, and now here Adam Gase got fired. So maybe I am the jinx. Maybe you send me to a city and I get a coach fired. I hope that the next head coach lasts longer than a year, just for my sake, But good question and good observation, Lewis, that I've had a lot of coaches to handle. So real briefly, back to Adam Gase. I think, I put out some stuff earlier this week that caught a lot of eyes, as far as the players in the locker room. And every guy has a different perspective. So I don't want to, put things out, and that's the overall perspective of everybody in the locker room. But there were players in the locker room that felt that, hey, maybe he was choosing favorites. Guys like Ryan Tannehill, other guys in the locker room may have been exempt from the type of criticism that, maybe other players did who weren't his favorites. And, that's maybe something that he learns in his next stop, that, hey, players notice that. Players notice reality, and they notice, who and they notice real, honestly. So I think that's something he can learn from, and I think there is probably fair to say that there are some examples where Adam Gase may have favored guys who he liked and trusted more than maybe he should have. So I don't think that's a full indictment of why he got fired. I think that ultimately, you look at an Adam Gase who wants to win now. He's intense. He wants to win. You look at the Dolphins who have a lot of holes in this roster, a lot of older players, and there's no set vision, and they're going to have to move on from their quarterback. So that signals rebuilding. And Adam Gase didn't seem like a guy who was going to stick around for a rebuilding period. So I think that's at the heart of that. I'll jump over to your question, Mac Aitha. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. Mac Aitha. Any news on Bieniemy's interview today? He and Fangio are the most intriguing. I actually think it may have got pushed back a day. Bieniemy's interview. I haven't heard a ton about Bieniemy for today, so that may be a Friday evening interview. I know it's going to be this week. The first interview is likely going to be Brian Flores, the Patriots defensive play caller. The Dolphins brass is going up to Massachusetts to interview him, so I think he'll actually be first, and then Bieniemy will be the second interview. So I don't believe, unless there's something that I don't know about, that they've interviewed any coaches yet, including Bieniemy. So I'll talk a little bit about Bieniemy as we go on. I'll answer a question from Jared about my alma mater, because I got to talk about that, and then I'll go ahead and jump into the candidates, Bieniemy and Fangio, and kind of give you a little spill on each of those guys. So Jared Hildebrand, and I'll go ahead and answer your question from Twitter earlier. Appreciate you for sending that in. If you guys want any questions answered from off the top, feel free to send them to my Twitter, send them to my DM, and I'll answer those throughout the way. So Jared Hildebrand had a question about Darren Rizzi earlier today on my Twitter. He asked, is Darren Rizzi's interview a real interview, or is this just something out of loyalty for his time with the team? And I think that's a good question, because you look at a special teams coordinator and you're like, what is the realistic chance that he gets a job? But one thing I can tell you, I have been surprised, and it's been eye-opening to me to see the support and hear the support from players, former and current, to have Darren Rizzi as head coach. And maybe that only holds a certain amount of weight. Maybe you say, hey, these guys weren't here for a winning culture. Why do we care about their opinion? That's a very fair reason. But to have several guys, I'm talking about, Kenyon Drake, Kiko Alonso, Kenny Stills, Vincent Taylor, Jakeem Grant, guys who don't even play special teams on a regular basis, some of those guys, as well as Jason Taylor, a Hall of Famer, Brian Hartline, a former Dolphins receiver who is now an Ohio State coach. All of these guys have come out, Devon Godchow, all of these guys have come out and put out their support for Dan Rizzi, and that's not even naming all of the players. So I think that, he has a better, it's a real interview. I actually asked Darren Rizzi about his opportunities to be a head coach earlier this year, and he kind of lit up. He was kind of cautious, like, hey, I don't want to feel like I'm threatening Adam Gase's job or anything, but this is something that I care about. He's a passionate dude. If you've ever heard Darren Rizzi talk, he captivates you, even if you don't know what he's talking about all the time. And I think that when you look at the way that NFL teams are hiring head coaches recently, they're looking for more of a CEO type. You're either looking for that offensive guru or CEO type. And while Darren Rizzi would have to kill it as far as coordinators he's hiring, he has the capability to be a teacher, to be a CEO type, to be a guy that the players in that locker room respect. And that could be something that could be important in a rebuilding period. At this point, I do not think that Darren Rizzi walks away with the job, but I think he has a better chance than more people realize. You look at one thing that may go against his favor is actually two things. He had a couple college head coaching stints. One of them at New Haven, where he was about a 500 coach. Second one at Rhode Island, where he went 3-9. Why wasn't he successful there? Was it talent? I wasn't there, so I don't answer that. And then the second thing, the Dolphins are branding this as a new era, something different than they've already done, and they'll have a hard time selling that if they're bringing an internal front office candidate and Chris Greer up to GM, and an internal front office coaching candidate, and Darren Rizzi to the head shop. So that is a little bit more a difficult sell. So I think those are two things that may be working against him a little bit. But I think that the player support is something that owner Stephen Ross, Chris Greer are probably not ignoring. So um, those are two things that I look out for. And then let's see what. Let's answer your question on West Virginia. Um, so Dana Horgerson, Jared Hilbrand says, "I'm from West Virginia. What do you think of Houston's hiring of Dana Holgerson? Go Cougs." I graduated Houston 4 years ago. I'm getting a little older. 4 years ago, yeah. Three and a half years ago. So they hired Dana Holgerson as their head coach, and they spent some money, $4 million a year, to go get him. I love the hire. I've watched West Virginia's high-powered offenses. Dana Holgerson can recruit. He was recruiting kids out to West Virginia, Morgantown, when I know I wouldn't go out there to West Virginia to play if I had other options. So that's impressive as a recruiter, and those high-octane offenses are something that would make Houston exciting. It didn't work out with Major Applewhite, but we're trying to be a big-time program here at UH. Ed Oliver is going to be a top 5, top 10 pick. We've won a New Year's Six Bowl, and I think eventually they'll get into a big-time conference. So I think Dana Holgerson is a great hire, and I'm excited to see what he does moving forward. Let me fire through a few of you guys' questions, and I'll go back into the coaching search and talk a little bit about that. Eric Lopez says, "You don't have to lie. Everyone moves to Miami to retire." I don't think I've retired yet. I'm 25, turning 26 in March. So although I love Miami, I was just at the beach yesterday, and I can see why people retire here. I'm here because I'm working, man. It's not just the beach. I promise. Let's see. Landon Flores says, "Why aren't the Fins looking at coaches with previous head coach experience?" Very good question. I actually talked about this a little bit in my article, a preview of the article that's coming out tomorrow on ESPN.com. Plug. The Dolphins only have one known candidate that they're interviewing with previous NFL head coaching experience, and that's Mike Munchak, who had a 3-year stint in Tennessee. He was a little under 500 there. He actually was going to get a 4th year, but he wasn't willing to fire some of his assistants there, so they let him go. Long-time offensive line coach, Hall of Fame player, and he's a guy who, if you're looking for, maybe a previous head coach experience, he's the one name that we know. And then obviously the Harbaughs, which are lingering over it, Jim and John Harbaugh, are obviously two names who have been previously head coach. But one stat that jumped out at me, and this is in the story tomorrow, is that the Dolphins' last 5 hires as full-time head coach, last 5 hires, and this includes Adam Gase, Cam Cameron, Nick Saban, who am I missing? Tony Sperano, and Joe Philbin. All 5 of those coaches were first-time head coaches, and none of them won a playoff game. I think that's something that makes you think, hey, can I buck the trend and go back towards a coach with previous head coaching experience? The only issue with that is that you're selling a rebuilding roster, you're selling a rebuilding team, and it's probably going to be tough for you to get a veteran head coach who has options to come to Miami for a team that is probably going to lose their first year. Let's see some responses about Rizzy's reactions. Yeah, I would love to see Rizzy's reactions. His storytelling and press conferences will be great as well. So there would be some joy there for them. Lewis is asking about the Steelers and AB. I'm gonna circle back to that question for you, Lewis, because that's something in the NFL topics. I'll go ahead and do a little bit more coaching search, and then I'll circle back because that's a really good topic to talk about. Hey, how you doing? How you doing, Shawnetta? Hey, how you doing, Ma? Mac is asking about Chris Richard, and that's a good transition for me to go back into the coaching search. Chris Richard's name is coming up a lot. Any idea what happened in Seattle? I actually alluded to this as something that needs to be answered in interviews for Chris Richard. I don't know exactly what happened in Seattle. From what I heard, there was obviously some need for change from Pete Carroll. He wanted something different. Obviously, Pete Carroll's a defensive coach, so maybe there is some type of philosophical difference between how Pete wanted the defense ran and how Chris wanted the defense ran. Obviously, Chris has landed on his feet with Dallas, and he's been shining well. But you've got to answer that question of why didn't it work well in Seattle, because those defenses were pretty good. So, I think that Chris Richard is a very good candidate. I think that, he's a guy who's earned a lot of respect from players in the league. He's fiery, and him along with Brian Flores and Eric Bieniemy have the the wherewithal and the interpersonal skills to be able to relate to this modern era player, and they're the type of players who can teach and lead guys through a rebuild. So I think all three of those candidates are good, and I think it's good for the Dolphins to interview those guys. So briefly, let me go over the other candidates, and then I'm going to go back and talk a little bit NFL and playoffs. Thank you guys for all these questions. Feel free to fire away more as you go along. I think we'll be following this coaching search closely over the next week or two. I'm going to go out of town this weekend. I had an aunt pass away, so I'm going to be out of town this weekend. So if any news comes out, that's probably why I'm going to be away. But otherwise, hopefully I can provide you guys with some details, some information, some insight, some news about the Dolphins and the NFL as a whole. So the other candidates, Eric Bieniemy. This is a guy who I think if I had to choose based on the candidates I've seen, I would hire Eric Bieniemy. He's my favorite for the choice. I have met Bieniemy a few times, talked to him. He's a very, very talented guy. He's a very smart guy, a very intense guy. And I believe that he's a guy who, coming off that Andy Reid tree, you've seen Doug Peterson, you've seen Matt Nagy have success, and Andy Reid vouches for this guy. He comes from a running back coach path, which hasn't traditionally, produced a lot of head coaches, but we've seen the success that Anthony Lynn has had over the last year, and he came from that track. So that should be evidence for teams that you can come from a different path other than quarterback. You can be a black male who's a running back coach a long time and potentially be a head coach. So I hope that he gets a true opportunity and that these aren't, necessarily Rooney Rule interviews. And he has 4 of them, so I don't believe they are. But I think that he's a guy who could really be maybe the next Anthony Lynn. He called plays at University of Colorado, so although he hasn't called them in Kansas City, he does have experience in that realm. And he's a guy who could really help out your protection game on the offensive line. He's knowledgeable on that, and obviously he's had a lot of success with running backs. And when you look at Kansas City, they have the top-ranked NFL offense, and Eric Bieniemy is a big part of that. So my favorite part of him is what I think he would be as a leader, as a CEO type, but he's also a smart enough guy to have control of the offensive reins as well. So I think he would be my leading candidate. Vic Fangio, 60-year-old defensive coordinator for the Bears. The Bears, he's doing a great job with them. Top-ranked scoring defense in the NFL. He's a guy with a lot of experience. I think he has 32 years of NFL coaching experience, 19 of them as a coordinator. So you get a guy who, although he hasn't had a head coach job, he has a ton of experience. He would have a lot of respect in that locker room because of the stories, because of the lessons that he can tell players. I am a little bit worried about his personality. He's a little bit reserved. I'm not sure how well that will transition to being a head coach. And at 60, not to be a little ageist here, you got to wonder, that doesn't happen often with first-time head coaches at that age. Would he be willing to stick around for a rebuild and see it through? Those are all valid questions as we head into the Vic Fangio interview. I mentioned Mike Munchak earlier. Brian Flores is another one, New England defensive play caller. He's a guy who has made the Patriots defense better this season, even though he doesn't have the official defensive coordinator title. One thing I would be a little worried with him about is that we haven't seen New England coaches be successful outside of Foxborough. Can he break the trend? We've seen Vrabel do it, pretty decent there. Bill O'Brien's had some success, but otherwise it's been pretty much a wash. So I would want to be sure about that before I make the hire. And also he's 37, so he's one of the younger candidates. But he does have high leadership skills. You look at a guy who has similar ties as Chris Greer, who started his career as a scout there. Brian Flores has worked as a scout. He's worked as a special teams coach. He's worked as an offensive assistant and on the defensive side of the ball. So you had that flexibility all around. And like I mentioned, if you're trying to defeat the king of the East, which has been New England for the last 10 years, a great option could be a guy who's been a part of that for all those 10 years in Brian Flores. So, and I mentioned Darren Rizzi earlier. I think those are all the candidates. I mentioned Chris Richard, mentioned Eric Bieniemy, I mentioned Mike Munchak earlier. So those are all the candidates there. Hopefully that long-winded response gives you some idea of what the coaches expect. So I'll answer my Super Bowl prediction when I go back up there with AB, and talk about the rest of the NFL. So I'm going to answer a couple more questions on the coaching search. I'm going to give my thoughts on the NFL playoffs, and then I'm going to give out our Super Bowl predictions and head out of here. As always, guys, thanks for supporting this Howling with the Wolf chat. This is my first season doing out here in Miami, and we had some growing pains trying to figure this whole thing out. But I love doing these chats, and I hope that I can continue to use a little bit sporadically throughout the off season. So definitely give me your feedback on what you like and what you don't like, times, different things that intrigue you that you would like to see, and we'll try to implement those in the off season as we move on to the next season. So I might have some Howling with the Wolf gear coming up, in the next year or so as well. So if you guys are interested in that, let me know. So back to the questions. Let's see. Jared Hilbrand's talking about Adam Gase sitting on the bench in the middle of the games. To me, that wasn't the issue. I know people blew it up, but like Gase mentioned, Sean McVay does it. Andy Reid does it. It only looks bad when you're losing. I think that obviously Adam Gase was an offensive mind, so he spent a lot of time on that side of the ball. But I don't think that bench issue was as much of an issue as maybe it was sought out to be. Luis Velasquez, and I got your question about AB. I'm gonna jump back to it soon. Is saying, so not being a Dolphins fan, being on the outside, it looks like the entire AFC is so far away. Patriots, how far away are the Dolphins from the Patriots, and what else do they need to close out the gap more this offseason? Very good question, and this will probably be the last question before I jump to NFL topics. Actually, Jimmy, I'll get your question, and then I'll jump to NFL topics. Lewis, they are not close. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The Dolphins are not close to the Patriots. They beat them here in Miami this year. They've had success in Miami. A lot of that's the humidity and the weather. Some of it's stuff like the Miami Miracle. But they're not close. And if they tell themselves they are close, then they're fooling themselves. And I think that's why we think that rebuilding is a very realistic and likely route for them to take. Because number one thing they have to do is get stability at quarterback. Ryan Tannehill, I do not believe is the answer, and I believe they started to look at other options, whether it's the 2019 or the 2020 draft. They have more older 30-plus players than core young people, young pieces, blue-chip players. Laramie Tunsil, Xavier Howard are their two blue-chip young players. Minka Fitzpatrick could join that group, but otherwise you need more young talent to compete with the Patriots of the world. And obviously you need a quarterback. So those are the things that they need to do. They've been the second best team in the AFC East for a while, for whatever that's worth, maybe a participation trophy or something. But I think they may have to drop to the bottom to potentially get back in the top. And maybe when they're ready to get back on the top, you'll see a guy like Tom Brady retired. And then maybe they're able to compete with some of the modern era quarterbacks. The younger quarterbacks that are now in the AFC East, and Sam Darnold and Josh Allen, although those teams may have a little bit of a head start in building. So hopefully, Lewis, that answers your question. I do not think they're close to the Patriots, and I think they may have to drop down to fourth before they could eventually become first. And Jimmy Amaya, hopefully I pronounced that right, says any college candidates, i.e. Shaw from Stanford. I said this early on Twitter, and this is kind of overarching for all college candidates. College candidates, you rarely are going to see their names out there for coaching gigs, NFL coaching gigs, until they're officially about to be hired or their agent wants their name out there for negotiation reasons. The reason why is because it hurts recruiting. They don't want to disturb what's going on with their situation. So you won't see that often. I think David Shaw is a great coach, but it doesn't seem like he's willing to leave college right now. So that's my thoughts on that. Real quick, I'm gonna circle back to Lewis's question about the Steelers situation and AB. Very interesting topic there. Antonio Bryant didn't show up for certain meetings and practices during the week, according to what we're hearing from reports and Mike Tomlin and whatnot. Mike Tomlin was not happy. There was discussion about trading him. There was rumors about trade requests per se. I'm always of the belief that, hey, players are allowed to have personality. They can let them express themselves, let them do exactly what they need to be human, because we're all human. Don't put them in a box. But the Steelers have dealt with a lot of distractions this year, and it's not a stretch to say that's the reason why they're not in the playoffs, whether it's Le'Veon Bell or Antonio Brown. They've got to make a decision. Is what Antonio Brown gives them on the field worth the distraction of off the field? And if the answer is no, then they've got to cut ties. Teammates are starting to turn on him in the locker room, and that becomes a potential issue. And that's what I would be worried about. Antonio Brown obviously is a Miami kid. He wears his sleeves on it, wears his emotions on his shoulders. He's not afraid to think what he wants, and I don't blame him for that. But you do have to worry about the consequences in a team sport. So I think that's a potentially volatile situation, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see a trade or even a cut situation with Antonio Brown, because Mike Tomlin, obviously, that situation has become more than he can handle. So NFL playoff predictions this week. I'm going to give my predictions for all of the games, and I'm going to give my Super Bowl predictions as well. In the AFC, I'm going to go ahead and pick the Indianapolis Colts over the Houston Texans, an upset. I think the Colts are running. I think they actually have a dark horse opportunity to potentially be a wild card Super Bowl team. I like what Andrew Luck is doing out there behind that offensive line. They've got a young, talented core. They may be a year away, but I think they can get at least one playoff win against a Houston team that's offensive line is struggling, and they lost Demaryius Thomas, so they don't have the receiver depth that they've had previously. So that's what I've got on the AFC side. I love the Los Angeles Chargers, and if you were watching my Howling with the Wolfe chats earlier this season, I thought they were a potential Super Bowl team, but I am worried about them playing a Baltimore Ravens team that already beat them, and they've got to travel cross country for an early Sunday game. It would be 10 o'clock their time. And I'm worried about how that will happen, and I think the Ravens actually win that game. So I've got the Ravens and the Colts moving on in the AFC. In the NFC, I have the Seahawks shutting down Zeke Elliott and being able to stop that Cowboys offense, forcing Dak Prescott into a few interceptions, and ultimately Seattle and Russell Wilson pull off the upset in Dallas. And what I think is the game of the weekend, Eagles versus the Bears. Bears have the best defense in the league. The Eagles have Nick Foles' magic from the Super Bowl run. I think that it's going to be a low-scoring game. It's going to come down to the final drives. But for me, it comes down that I trust Nick Foles a little bit more than I trust Mitch Trubisky. And I think the Eagles pull off the upset there. Although the Bears are extremely talented team, and if they get past the Eagles, I think they could be a Super Bowl team. So my predictions for the Super Bowl are going to be, I think the Saints come out of it in the NFC. I think that team is extremely talented, and they have a bad taste in their mouth after last season. So I think the Saints, ultimately are the team to beat in the NFC. And then the AFC, I think that's a little bit more wide open. I mentioned the Colts as a potential surprise team. Baltimore, I think they're going to win their first round game. You got the Patriots who are vulnerable, and then you got the Chiefs as well. I think I'm going to go out a little bit off in the realms, and I think I'm going to ride what I was believing. I think the Colts ride an incredible wave and find a way to get to the AFC championship and knock off. It's probably going to be, given the situation, they'll probably knock off the Chiefs. The Patriots in the AFC championship to go ahead and get in. And I think that we see a Colts Saints Super Bowl, and I think the Saints will win it. So a little bit off the radar, especially with the Colts, but those are my Super Bowl predictions. That's it for me today, man. Thank you, guys. We'll have another chat here, either right before the coaching search is done or right after, and give you guys a little bit more insight. Thanks for joining. Share with your friends. Subscribe to my page. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Trying to get this thing to grow. And as always, have a good night.